Everybody. If you don't know me, my name is Anthony Walker, Deputy CEO of techUK, and delighted to have the pleasure of opening the afternoon session of this Tech and Innovation Summit. And for the next half hour, we're going to really kind of focus into one of the issues that I think was a kind of consistent theme throughout the morning, which is the sort of central role that regulation can play when we're thinking about how we kind of unleash the potential of new innovative technologies. And that's a role that can be both either kind of positive or negative in terms of get the regulation wrong, and we can really kind of slow down and hamper the ability to innovate at pace and scale. But get the regulation right, and actually you can really create the kind of environment that really crowds in further innovation into your economy. And that's why we were really delighted just over a year ago when the new government announced its intention to establish this new Regulatory Innovation Office, which has sort of really got the specific role of trying to think about how you have a kind of adaptive and innovative approach to regulation itself in order to accelerate the pace of innovation in the UK. But we were even more delighted when the government also appointed Lord David Willetts to be the executive chair of RIO, because I can think of few people who, to be frank, get more excited about both innovation and regulation. David, I think you're pretty high up on that list. And so really delighted to have David here with us for the next half hour. Where we really wanted to kind of explore a little bit more about the Regulatory Innovation Office, or RIO, as it's known, about kind of what you've been up to in the first year, and I guess some of the path going forward. But I wondered if we could start with, could you for the people in the room, give us a bit of an explanation of what you see the role as RIO being, and why you think it plays an important role in terms of getting the innovation ecosystem right in the UK.
Yeah, well, thanks. And look, first of all, thank you for inviting me along today, because I have to say what you guys do and the links and the excellent communication we have with your team is kind of what helps us function as RIO. So our job is to make sure that regulation does not stand in the way of innovation and new technologies. As you rightly said, that doesn't mean there should be an environment of zero regulation. Indeed, sometimes you need to put a regulatory regime in place in order to enjoy the benefits of technology. I also chair the UK Space Agency. The only reason why we've got launch soon to happen from Saxiford is that there was previously no regulatory or legal regime for launch, and we passed legislation in 2018 to create one. So we try to have sensible regulation. We don't want regulation that gets in the way of innovation. We don't want regulation that just assumes the old way of doing things and doesn't make new ways possible. And I guess how we can help is that because we get so much information, including from you guys, and feedback from groups such as venture capital investors, and both startup companies and major international companies, we often see for big technologies benefits and gains and opportunities that aren't always appreciated by an individual regulator, often with quite a narrow focus. And so we can work with them to broaden their perspective, to challenge them on areas where we think regulation is too rigid, and work with them to try to create a better regime with a modest amount of money in our back pocket as well, which does help.
So just to help people in the room a little bit, so RIO sits within DCIT.
Yeah,
Can you explain a little bit kind of what it, functionally what it looks like?
Right. We're a group of just over 30 officials in a distinctive unit within DCIT. We're not an arm's length body or anything like that. And we have a close partnership with the Regulatory Horizons Council, which has been going for several years. They do the more kind of strategic long-term thinking, and we are more operational and trying to achieve things more immediately now. We have I guess insofar as I fit in, and thank you for your generous remarks earlier, there are, of course, ministers that we report to. Minister Liz Lloyd, who's just arrived, Patrick Vallance, who has been heavily involved. So there's a ministerial engagement, and extends minister to minister. There's a team of officials. But in regulation, there's also regulatory agencies with chairs and chief execs. And I guess one of the reasons why the government approached me and slotted me in is I do find I'm able to talk to chairs and chief execs of regulatory bodies as well, and then report those conversations to ministers.
No, really excellent. Okay, so you sit there within DSIT. You've got this kind of role that looks across all the regulatory bodies, and this kind of, in a way, kind of looking to join them up. Then tell me about the sort of view from the other end of the telescope, as it were, in terms of, so I think you had initially identified kind of 4 technology areas that you were going to kind of work on and try to...
Yeah, and we've got, and we sit in DSIT, I should just add, we sit in DSIT because our focus is technology, and DSIT is the government's centre for expertise on what's happening in science and tech. The overall lead on regulation is with DBT. If you are having a terrible time getting planning permission, that is not for us. Thank heavens. If you've got an exciting startup and you don't think a regulator is permitting an innovative new technology which you think brings great benefits, public and private, then that is for us. And ministers set us 4 priority areas that we've been working on. They are drones, engineering biology, space, particularly space launch, and AI for medicine. We just had our first anniversary, and now ministers are considering what else we might do. I think the whole AI agenda, we can't take the whole of the AI agenda, there's just so much happening, but I do think applying AI to medicine, healthcare, pharmaceutical programs is a strong candidate. And something else which I'm very aware of in my involvement in science and tech in different ways over the years is the rise of the security angle and how almost all technology now is dual use. And there's often a civil regulatory regime and a separate set of defense requirements. I think it would be great if we could help build greater bridges between the civil and the security military side. That's another candidate. And we're expecting in the coming weeks and months to have a final kind of steer for the second year from our minister. That's
really, really good to hear. I mean, actually, within the techUK membership, one of the things that I'm hearing more and more is of companies kind of coming across kind of complexities and issues that arise around that kind of dual use nature, and particularly for some exporting companies, kind of export controls and export licenses, becoming a much bigger issue that they're having to navigate. On
Though actually also a bit of kind of free advice. Sometimes the defence angle is an extra complication, but sometimes people, innovators assume the safe route to go down is the civil. If you can persuade the military that this is a priority, you can get regulatory approval a hell of a sight better, more rapidly than through some of the civil processes. So the military security angle can sometimes be an advantage, not a disadvantage.
It's an interesting hot tip I wasn't expecting to come out of today's discussion. You're looking at these kind of, essentially you're looking at quite novel technologies or whether are kind of novel applications of technologies that also potentially throw up kind of novel regulatory questions.
Yeah.
And it's your... are there any kind of, I mean, you've only been going a year, and a lot of it, the work has been sort of putting the foundations in place. But have there been sort of examples where you could sort of say, where you've been able to sort of quickly kind of join the dots between areas? Yeah,
look, we have we approach it from 2 angles. There's first what I call simply kind of whack-a-mole. There's especially in those 4 priority areas, there's an individual company, and as I say, and I pay tribute to you guys, techUK may well be one of the organisations that helps identify it, where they just have a frustration about the regulatory regime, and I don't think it's in anyone's interest for us to kind of declare war on the regulator or publicly humiliate the regulator, but we can work with the regulator and say, hang on, actually, surely it makes sense to speed this thing up or to make this possible, and we have observed that if we get involved, sometimes processes can be quicker. And insofar as there's a degree of discretion, you can improve things. So there's some whack-a-mole stuff, and then there's wider themes. So, for example, often especially when it comes to general purpose technologies, I buy the doctrine, which I attribute above all. The person who educated me on this years ago was the great Joyce Tate, still at the Regulatory Horizons Council, that don't regulate a technology, regulate its applications. And that is a very good principle, but it has one uncomfortable consequence that you may find if you're working in an area of technology, you face several different regulators. And the more we can bring them together in a shared endeavour with a no wrong door kind of principle, we're very keen on that. And before our existence, I think the first people to do that properly is the Digital Regulators Cooperation Forum is a great example. And we've just put some extra money, about £800,000 into them to help them bring their data together. In engineering biology, it was pretty fragmented. And we now do have a group of 11 different regulators involved in synthetic biology, engineering biology, and a website with information about each one and a contact details for each one and a principle they'll try to pass you on, and also to the right person, and also wherever possible, if there are multiple regulators involved, decision taking should be wherever possible simultaneous, not sequential. What people hate is they just finally get through one regulatory process and then the regulator says, and now we're going to hand you over to the health and safety executive. That is not what people want to hear. People think, hang on, couldn't we have done this at the same time with health and safety? So trying to avoid long sequential processes, things like that.
I mean, I think that's where there is a huge opportunity for the UK, because I think actually generally we've been quite good in the UK of not regulating technologies, but looking at applications and uses. But as you say, you then get this multiplicity of kind of, regulatory contact points. And I think bringing in this kind of connective tissue across the piece, I think is we've seen it be really helpful with the DRCF in terms of the communications kind of regulators. And I think and I think that's why we as techUK were such enthusiastic supporters of Rio, because we could see we could see the potential benefit. So, I mean, you've only just had your first year anniversary. Are there any sort of kind of lessons that have kind of come through from that first year that you're thinking of applying forward?
Yeah, and look, I've actually been at it for 6 months, and there was already a fantastic team of officials beavering away in place before I arrived. Yeah, I mean, there are so many lessons already. Let me give you one, which is, I think I feel able to talk about this because it was a mistake kind of when I was involved in originally. So I served on the board of UKRI for quite a while, and I can remember the Industrial Strategy Challenge Funds, and the board allocating money between a range of different industrial strategy challenge fund applications, and one of them was Future Flight. And we spent over £100 million over 5 years on Future Flight. Looking now, what I realise is that was largely a technology push programme. Although there was some engagement with CAA, it doesn't appear to have led to any significant regulatory innovation. And literally only this morning, when UKRI had a little event in Parliament for some of the research programs and technologies they were backing, and they had to show what the UKRI had done. There was a drone company, not one I'd come across before, actually. It was a drone company, and they had developed a drone as a result of Future Flight, and they'd been in the program, and they'd got their drone. And now, after 5 years of Future Flight, and about 2 years since it ended, they realised the only trouble was they had no regulatory basis for operating their drone. Why the hell did we not get the regulatory regime sorted out when we at UKRI were spending £100 million on developing these new technologies? Why are we now sitting in Rio trying to work with the CAA to create a regulatory regime that enables us to operate drones that have emerged because of public spending on them 5 years ago? Yeah, so, and I think Patrick Vallance is very keen on it. It is... it doesn't necessarily mean you need to write the regulation straight, but you just need to get these things moving. The less And the sequential thing of doing some technology push and then trying to work out the regulations is just off the pace. It just won't do.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting, actually. One of the things that we've been looking at, looking beyond the realm of regulation, but a similar point, which is thinking about the, there are companies that emerge out of UKRI programs and funding, but then are not getting connected early enough to later sources of funding. So how do you link the British Business Bank, for example, in more closely with UKRI on the funding stream as well?
There is reported to have been, I was not at this, there is reported to have been a meeting hosted in the Treasury where research councils, Innovate UK, the British Business Bank, and the National Wealth Fund all sat around the same table. This is a historic moment in British innovation policy. I mean, I tried to get Innovate UK and British Business Bank to talk together, and partly because of the Treasury rules that the British Business Bank was operating under were so different from the grant-making function of Innovate UK. It was totally impossible. And one of the things that Patrick completely gets is, although we're not supposed to think of this as just a kind of linear process, in reality, if these bodies are all in some kind of coherent alignment, that is massive progress. And then if you add to the mix Rio, so that insofar as there are regulatory issues, they are identified earlier, not like the future flight experience. And if you then throw in procurement, which is the big prize that has so far eluded us, but I would love regulatory clearance also to involve handing over with a tick in the box to public procurement agencies. For regulators have endorsed it now across Whitehall, you should bloody well be feeling able and encouraged to buy the thing. So if you've got the sequential stages of technology funding, plus a pro-tech regulatory function, plus smart use of regulation. Now, we're not yet there yet, but I do actually think Patrick completely gets this, and his vision as Science and Tech Minister is all this comes together. And I feel we are closer to getting it all together than at any point in my 15 years plus involvement in policy in this area.
I was going to say, I'm sort of sitting here thinking this almost sounds like a coherent plan. This is really, this is good stuff. Coming back to, so I want to come back to Rio a bit. You said you were about 30 people, sitting with DCIT. There is a slight danger, of course, that you could get overwhelmed by requests coming from all over the place for to help with people who are trying to navigate kind of regulatory. What's the process that you kind of go through to determine what you do next? And I suppose linked to that is how are you doing the bit of kind of working with businesses? Because I can only imagine that even after today, you'll get more people knocking on your door. So how are you managing that?
And look, we can't deal with each individual request. There has to be some kind of triage function. That's why the kind of 4 priority areas really helps. And as I said earlier, and it is ultimately a decision for ministers, and we report to and act on their advice. But I suspect there won't be a total transformation of the 4 priorities, but I think that I can see some extensions, drones becoming a wider kind of autonomous systems agenda, AI for healthcare in a rather broader interpretation than we've had so far. So probably some extension of what we do. And again, look, and not just you, of course, it's the CBI, it's Made UK, it's Startup Coalition, representative intermediary bodies like you guys that bring people together and say, and like we had a great meeting at the Royal Academy of Engineering on drones, and they knew, and you suddenly find you're sitting in a table and they've got half a dozen operators and 1 or 2 venture capitalists who try to invest in them. Those type of meetings are particularly valuable, and in some ways those are a more efficient way of us getting information than individual complaints. Though if it's an individual problem in the 4 priority areas, there's we may follow up.
Okay, so if I was a relatively new startup company, interesting kind of drone technology, But I was looking ahead and saying, "Oh, I'm not sure about some of these regulatory issues that seem to be popping up that maybe I wasn't aware of." What advice would you give me in terms of how to kind of work with you in order to start to explore some of those issues?
Well, one of the things, this is kind of our responsibility rather than the individual company, but it's one of the other things I've learned is how hard it is to predict exactly the nature of the regulatory problem that people face. And it can be anything from a middle-ranking official in a regulator interpreting a quite broad term in a text with to give it a rather narrow and restrictive meaning, and not necessarily his or her fault, because 5 years ago, in the sort of institutional memory, there was a minister who got exercised about it all and said, and I'm only half inventing this, I've had a lot of constituency complaints about noise from drones. We really bloody well need to do something about it. And you've learned that you've got to be very careful and ask about noise. So you find that, so it's quite discretionary. You can say, hang on, guys, do you really need to be quite so restricted? Are you really saying that as soon as one complaint that you want to intervene and stop the drone operation? You can. So sometimes it's quite discretionary stuff. At the other end of the scale, you find there really are quite significant legal problems that require primary legislation. And believe it or not, when it comes to robots and autonomous systems on the highway, the Highways Act 1835, prohibiting carriages on the pavement, is quite a significant problem. And you can do an ingenious workaround. And with our Minister Liz Lloyd, I was in Milton Keynes the other day seeing an ingenious workaround where alongside all the roads in Milton Keynes, there's often a very wide kind of cycle path, which is in private ownership, so not covered by the Highways Act. Although you can find workarounds, and sometimes a body that will turn a blind eye, if you're a VC investor and your legal team are doing due diligence, they will say, hang on, guys, you're absolutely sure that you've got a legal regime that enables you to use this robot in this way. So and it's one of our, and that's something else we can do in Rio. We can form an alliance with the Department of Transport. The Chancellor personally is a strong backer of all this. So in the process, I remember from when I was in government before, of the sort of the decisions on what the priorities are for legislation, you can say this peculiar thing from the Department of Transport really does actually matter. It would be great if you could find some legislative time to amend the 1835 Highways Act. So you find the whole, and you don't know in advance quite what you're going to find.
It would be really good if the policy solution to enabling sort of some of those autonomous vehicles wasn't that we have to build lots of new towns in order to have an infrastructure that can run autonomous vehicles.
I give a plug for Milton Keynes. It is a great, if you guys are trying to, it is quite a centre for innovation. It's got a very forward-looking council. It's got quite a pro-innovation regime. If you're looking for an environment, and it can't be a totally controlled environment like Culham or one of the protected secure areas, Milton Keynes is a good place to start.
You mentioned earlier on some of the kind of funding capabilities that you've got. Can you tell us a little bit more about that in terms of, I think there's the Regulators Pioneers Fund and the AI Capability Fund. What are they and how do they work?
Well, the Regulatory Pioneers Fund, almost every conversation I have with a regulator, they say, of course, we'd love to do all this. You're absolutely right. We've got to do more on technology. Sadly, we haven't got the staff and haven't quite got the funding. If you're able to help us out on that, then we could help you out on the regulatory regime. And we have a modest, we cannot become the soft touch where every regulator gets extra money via us. We really do not have a capacity for that. But sometimes you do think there is genuinely a problem. And one of the uses of the Regulatory Pioneers Fund, there was definitely the Food Standards Agency was totally overwhelmed post-Brexit with writing a domestic regulations around food and food consumption. And we have put money in, which has helped them massively speed up on innovative foods and plant-based meats and such like. We have put money into funding work in that area, including staffing and funding a sandpit and all that kind of thing. So that's how the Regulated Pioneers Fund is a kind of selected resource that often helps us promote a bit of innovation amongst the regulators. The AI fund is more specifically focused on, as its name implies, on the use of AI. And I think we've had too much focus on the regulation of AI and not enough focus on using AI for better regulation. And AI is a fantastic means of providing access to often an incredibly complicated corpus of regulatory material. And so, for example, most recently, I referred to the Digital Regulation Cooperation Forum earlier. We have put in £800,000 to enable them to establish, I mean, this is shocking. This tells you how far behind we are. Not all the material they've got is machine readable. So the minimum thing to do is at least let's get a proper database of machine readable material so that you can then use an LLM in order to properly study and inform people as to how answer questions on the corpus of regulatory material. So we're trying to use AI to improve the quality of the service and the capacity to an individual company to ask sensible questions about the regulatory regime it faces.
No, it's really, really, I think, really helpful. I think, and really addresses a significant gap. So you've just done your first year, and I think you did a really interesting report on the first year. What does the year ahead look like? What are the kind of key things to look forward to?
Well, I think we are, as I say, ministers have finally got to pronounce on exactly what our priorities are for the second year. But one thing is already clear, and it was announced the other day. And again, it starts with the frustration and the regime for the use of AI in diagnostics and medicine is shockingly unclear. And exactly the circumstances in which you can use ambient AI and the MHRA guidance. I personally, don't claim to be an expert on this. I think the MHRA guidance has a slightly different feel and more constructive feel to it than the NHS England letter of June, which had a sort of warning note about things like the use of AI. I think a layman's summary would be you can use AI as a summation, but you can't use it as a diagnostic tool without going through MHRA assessment. However, the excellent Alex Denniston from the Regulatory Horizons Council has just been appointed to chair a commission on a suitably tight timescale, 6 months, to look into this problem and try to provide much clearer guidance. And it is, for me, again, this has been around for ages, but there are still software companies who turn up and just think it's software, it's not a medical device, we should have nothing to do with medical regulation. I think there comes a point when its use is so directly related to diagnostic assessments with risks to patients that is a naive view of the world. There comes a point when the MHRA or some other regulator does have a legitimate interest, but people are entitled to have much clearer guidance as to the circumstances in which MHRA or other regulators get involved. And I really hope that report, which is, as I say, on this kind of 6-month program, I think that could be very significant and useful.
Obviously, we've talked a lot about enabling the way in which regulation can enable innovation. And this is a room full of people who are really kind of focused on trying to make things happen. But obviously, there's a crucial balance to be struck, which is about making sure that we, maintain public trust and ensure, the security and safety around new technologies. How do you view that as part of your kind of role and remit, and kind of how do you make sure that you're getting that balance right?
Yeah, that's a very fair point. And look, that is, and that's where ultimately these are decisions for democratically accountable ministers. and obviously the GM episode 20 years ago now is a warning of how things can go terribly wrong if you kind of lose contact with the public. I used to find in my day that, you know, commissioning Science-Wise or some of those other organisations to do kind of structured citizens dialogues, you always learnt from that. There are always messages, and actually perfectly reasonable layperson's messages, which the science community ignored. Like they'd say things like, why exactly are the scientists doing this? Are they just trying to get a prize for it or make some money out of it? Or why does it actually make our day-to-day lives better? So that is a real-world issue. Some of the regulators are better at that than others, but the reason why I think sometimes in the British culture we went too far in saying these decisions are so tricky you can't possibly trust politicians with them. You have to give them to entirely arm's-length bodies that don't have any political supervision. Actually, my view is that ultimately ministerial accountability, including regulators being accountable to ministers who have that in their minds, is part of the system and a desirable and a good feature of the system.
As I thought might happen, this half hour has gone very quickly. But there's one last question I can't resist asking, which is, as you're sort of looking ahead, scanning across, seeing these different areas of innovation, these emerging kind of technologies, what's the thing that you're most excited about in terms of its potential over the next 10 years? What's the thing that's sort of really...
Well, there's been quite a bit of comment on Substacks and elsewhere on kind of the electric vertical, where everything from batteries, drones, software, connectivity, robotics comes together in a kind. And I'm aware of this partly from the space angle. People treat the fact that Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk are funding great big satellite constellations as if they're kind of billionaires' toy things. They aren't. These are... Elon Musk is after complete connectivity via the car and his satellite system, and Jeff Bezos is after complete connectivity via the house and his satellite constellation. And they in turn enable you to operate robots, and they're essential for drones and getting Ofcom to understand exactly how concentrated some of the spectrum requirements are in areas where all this is happening. I find that as a kind of integrated picture. I've given a layman's account of some really fascinating material out there. I think that kind of nexus, I think, is very exciting and very significant. And an organisation such as Rio can help look at it with a coherent overview.
I wish we had another half hour where we could explore all of that, because that is a really, really kind of fascinating area. Lord David Willetts, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been fantastic to get your insights. I think everybody in the room will see why I think techUK was so enthusiastic about Rio, but also so enthusiastic about your appointment to the role. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Anthony. Thanks very much.